Nearly 6 million Jews, 2/3 of the Jews in Europe, were killed by the Nazi regime and its collaborators during the Second World War, while the rest of the world remained silent. They died of hunger or disease in the ghettos of Poland and the occupied Soviet Union. They were shot down in huge numbers by the Einsatzgruppen troops on the Eastern Front, often with the complicity of the local authorities, but the majority of them perished in the gas chambers and wagons of the 6 death camps situated in Poland: Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek, Sobibor, Treblinka, and Auschwitz-Birkenau.
We, the survivors, are not the true witnesses. We are those who, by their prevarications or abilities or good luck, did not touch bottom. Those who did so have not returned to tell about it, or have returned mute. The destruction was not told by anyone, just as no one ever returned to describe his own death. We speak in their stead, by proxy.
You
can't talk about Auschwitz. It just can't be done. Your memory just rejects it. We can't accept the death of a child. We just can't understand it when a child dies. So how can we grasp it when 6 million die?
When you hear the story, when you read about it, you say to yourself, even I sometimes say to myself, it's, well, unthinkable.
In the heart of Berlin, the Germans celebrated their new Chancellor Adolf Hitler. After the humiliation of defeat in 1918, then the disastrous consequences for Germany of the 1929 economic crisis, his promise, "Give me 4 years' time and you will not recognize Germany," was a seductive one and set the stage for a general euphoria.
To describe that euphoria, you have to bear in mind the 14 years that have preceded it, years of more or less continuous crisis of a democracy which has been in all sorts of trouble right from the beginning, practically. Economic crisis, political crisis, social crisis, and then ultimately a crisis of the state.
There was terrible unemployment. Money had no value anymore. There was a worldwide economic crisis. Germans were very worried, so Hitler was there to save them.
Everyone believed in it all. People everywhere were crazy about Hitler. There were hundreds of thousands, half the workforce unemployed.
Massive inflation that wiped out the entire middle class, and also the idea that Germany's gross national product lost 40% in the years between 1929 and 1932. And Hitler offered them a solution.
He had no party support. Nobody really supported him. He didn't even have 2% of the people that would vote for his Nazi party in the elections, not until the breakthrough election in 1930. So they had no reason to believe that this man was just anything other than a crazy guy, kind of a difficult one from a very fringe small party. But whether Hitler even believed it was possible,
how this complete nobody could come up and then magnetize the German population and much of Europe.
Hitler had already built his own myth. He used to rehearse his poses in front of the mirror.
Hitler himself was an unusual individual, that's without a shadow of doubt, but the bulk of what we call his charismatic image and so on was, of course, a creation of propaganda. It was built up around him and cultivated by Goebbels and by the rest of the propaganda machine.
As a doctor of philosophy, Joseph Goebbels saw Hitler's rise to power in 1933 as a dream come true. Hitler created for him a ministry of propaganda, a decisive tool in bringing the population to heel. Goebbels passionately supported the cult of Hitler, a myth that would prove very effective indeed. He had 1,300 agents under his command. He controlled all the media. He oversaw and censored all the press, the radio, and especially the cinema. Goebbels understood the importance of image, of staying in the headlines. These films were technically perfect. Dolly shots, crane shots, several cameras. The public should feel they were living through it all with Hitler.
Before 1919, Hitler's life up to then had been one of failure. He ended up basically as a tramp, lived in a men's home in Vienna down till 1913 when he moved to Munich. Then the war came, and Hitler in 1915 already had a sort of ideological motivation in this war, which was cleansing Germany of foreign elements. The key moment was the defeat in 1918, and then comes into contact with the infant Nazi Party, a very small organization in Munich, and then gets involved in the Nazi Party and soon becomes its star speakers. It will be the duty of any national government to bring about the removal of the Jews altogether.
Hitler believes that the Jews betrayed Germany in 1918, that the Jews stabbed Germany in the back, that the Jews are part of an international conspiracy against Germany, that the Jews cannot be loyal or patriotic Germans, that if Germany is ever to be great, you have to destroy the influence of the Jews.
Hitler always had that in mind, although most Germans didn't want to believe it. He had no other intention. It was already there in Mein Kampf.
When Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, My Struggle, his struggle was against the Jew. The Jew, not the Jews. The Jews are individuals, the Jew is a concept. I've used the term redemptive anti-Semitism. To save the world, the Jews had to be wiped out.
He talked about how gassing 10 or 15,000 Jews during World War I might have saved hundreds of thousands of German lives.
In Mein Kampf, Hitler said if the Jews win their struggle for domination of the world, the earth, will go spinning through the universe without life. In other words, the victory of the Jews would be the destruction of humanity. And Hitler said, I am doing the work of God in opposing the Jews. Now, this was very, very different to the anti-Semitism of reactionaries or conservatives or Catholics or Protestant or leftists. It was much more radical, and it was lethal.
What Hitler did was to convey to them their own anger and their hatreds and their resentments in the way in which they understood.
Der Völkerstreit oder Hass untereinander, wird gepflegt von ganz bestimmten Interessenten. Es ist eine kleine, wurzellose internationale Clique, die die Völker gegeneinander hetzt, die nicht will, dass sie zur Ruhe kommen. Es sind das die Menschen, die überall und nirgends zu Hause sind, die nirgends einen Boden haben, auf den sie gewachsen sind, sondern die heute in Berlin leben, morgen genauso gut in Brüssel sein können, übermorgen in Paris oder mit in Prag oder in Wien oder in London und die sich überall zu Hause fühlen. Es sind die einzigen, die wirklich als internationale Elemente anzusprechen sind, weil sie überall ihre Geschäfte betätigen können.
Lurking behind each and every one of their enemies, the Nazis saw just one face, that of the Jewish race.
The elimination of the Jews became essential to the salvation of the German nation, and there was an apocalyptic dimension to the vision that Hitler had.
Most, I think, believed, wanted to believe at least, that somehow their friends, their neighbors, the country, they would finally come back to their senses and Hitler would be gone.
No one in Germany, not even the Nazis, could be sure that they would survive in power more than 1, maybe 2 years.
The whole of Europe was saying that a thug had come to power, one with no political experience who'd surrounded himself with a gang of hoodlums. Who were these people? What was this party? They thought things would calm down, that it wouldn't last.
Small group of men with the most radical hatred of Jews take power, and then they have all the forces of a modern state at their disposal to begin their war against the Jews.
The most culturally developed, most intellectually advanced, the tradition with the greatest culture and literature, music, philosophy, and art. The country of Goethe and Schiller became the country of Hitler and Goebbels and Göring.
What happened in Germany was terrible, because in Germany, the Jews particularly loved the country. The Russian Jews didn't love Russia. Russia had always been anti-Semitic. Polish Jews didn't love Poland. Poland had always been anti-Semitic. German Jews loved Germany with a profound love. They wanted to be more German than the Germans.
By 1933, there's somewhere between 500 and 600,000 Jews in Germany. They're, for the most part, very assimilated. Most of them are in what we would call the upper middle class. They are in business, they are in professions, in trade.
The Jews were fully fledged German citizens, and they felt themselves to be German, and the vast bulk of the German Jewish population wanted to be totally assimilated, and they were already engaged in areas such as culture and in the press and so on, and literature. And in these areas, they excelled, of course, then to play a very significant role in the development of all these areas.
They were proud to be Germans and couldn't believe that the people that they'd lived with for so many years were somehow gone crazy.
Among German Jews, particularly families who had lived in Germany for generations, even centuries, many Jews felt themselves to be Germans of the Jewish religion. So in other words, Germans first and Jews second.
My family has been here for hundreds of years. You know, I'm as much German as anybody else is. Just because I'm Jewish, I didn't even, you know, some people say I learned from Hitler that I was a Jew. I didn't think about being a Jew.
There was a sense, a perception, that the Jews were not quite German. They were always a little foreign, that they had perhaps too much power, or they were too important in the economy.
In the spring of 1933, you had an outbreak of various kinds of attacks upon Jews.
The various German courts were subjected to abuse. Brown shirt troops invaded chambers, molested judges, assaulted lawyers whom they believed to be Jewish, and drove them out of the courts.
And it was clear that while Jews would be chased out of public life, out of civil service jobs, out of jobs that are carried out in public. So you couldn't be a Jewish actor, you couldn't be a Jewish journalist, you couldn't be a Jewish musician. That would be gone. But private enterprise, Jewish businesses were still legal.
Members of the Hitler Youth are painting stars of David on Jewish shop fronts with the word Jude. It's back to the yellow armband of the Middle Ages. You want to stay home and not have to go out and see it all. Being stigmatized is a hard thing. I wonder how people will react. Will they go along with it?
The boycott of the 1st of April 1933 was not the beginning of a massive boycott of German Jewish businesses and professions. No, it lasted for one day and then it was finished. And Goebbels was a little disappointed.
Wir wissen, dass es noch eine ganze Reihe Leute gegeben hat, die
Some people still shopped at Jewish stores,
ja, trotzdem in jüdische Geschäfte gegangen sind und
even though there were uniformed guards at the door who forbade them access and took their names.
Wurde, dass man sich ihre Namen merken würde. Wir wissen,
We know from the private diaries of some Jews that many non-Jewish customers behaved towards them in a very touching way that day, bringing them flowers and greeting them openly in the street because they were against the boycott.
Ich habe nur so viel, wenn ich das Wort Kultur höre, dann greife ich schon nach meinem Revolver.
I am suffocating in the Reich of evil, of hatred and of violence. No longer have the strength to breathe this poisoned air. In the coming days, they'll be publicly burning Jewish and Marxist books. It's incredible barbarism. But those who were protesting are already getting used to it, and little by little their indignation is waning.
The burning of books in 1933, in May 1933, was a way to show the German people very vividly that there were bad ideas, modern ideas, Jewish ideas that they should stay away from.
It wasn't Goebbels' idea. It was the Nazi Students' League. They asked him to come and give a speech.
Student demands to cleanse the libraries, to cleanse the universities of Jewish influence. But Goebbels could see this was a fantastic educational exercise. Burning books, burning ideas, that was a way to put down a line.
And basically, of course, he too believed the books should be burnt. He gave an inflammatory speech. He'd later write that it was his best speech ever.
Das Zeitalter eines überspitzten jüdischen Intellektualismus ist nun zu Ende. Und der kommende deutsche Mensch wird nicht nur ein Mensch des Buches, sondern auch ein Mensch des Charakters sein.
Goebbels, will auch
Goebbels wanted to persecute the capital's Jews and exclude them through every kind of discrimination.
It was important for Joseph Goebbels because he was a fanatical anti-Semite.
And it was the same everywhere else, in whether you look in the music sphere or the cultural sphere. People were prepared to do the work of the regime, and they had their own careers to follow, and Jews didn't fit into the way in which the regime was developing, and the regime was putting pressure on everybody to exclude Jews.
So Jews were forbidden to appear on a German theatre stage. They could put on Jewish plays for their own audience, though, a Jewish audience. No great German authors, no German theatre, no German music.
By then, Jews were already on the outside of society, and academia was no different to anything else.
Most of them became spokespersons for Nazi ideology. In the 30s, there were endless Nazi texts on the Jews, on race, and all of that. They published endless books and articles in the press, German intellectual texts. They were part of the regime, a central part of the regime.
The greatest philosopher of the 20th century, by most accounts, was Martin Heidegger. And Martin Heidegger used his position as the embodiment of German philosophy to dismiss Jewish faculty, to get rid of Jewish students, and to see the Nazis as the ultimate expression of German civilization.
Then one day it was all over. Heidegger stood up on a chair and declared, "There are no more Jews," and that was it. You can be an intellectual and also a racist, an intellectual and an extreme nationalist, a xenophobe and an anti-Semite.
When there's an ideological dictatorship, the weakest part of the population is its intellectuals. They can very easily be manipulated.
If you were sympathetic towards Jews, or you showed sympathy towards them, then you invited some sort of retaliation yourself from Nazi hordes, Nazi supporters, and Nazi thugs, and so on. So you could yourself be subjected. So there was an element of fear.
Any teachers who opposed the Nazis were quickly removed.
From 1933 on, anti-Jewish propaganda intensified, and anti-Semitism became an argument, a propaganda tool to justify dispossessing the Jews of all their property. And they had a lot of property in Germany. They had factories, workshops, land, houses. We're going to take all that from them. We're going to ban them from all the professions, from all public services. And people like this sort of talk.
For instance, if you have a small town and there is a Jewish bakery and a bakery owned by a non-Jew, the Nazi Party pressures people not to shop at the Jewish bakery. The man goes bankrupt, he has to sell at a very low price and leaves for the city.
Getting rid of Jews everywhere was very profitable. You got your hands on their property, you took their jobs.
Many Germans saw getting rid of the Jews as a great opportunity to solve their own problems and to better their situation. They were prepared to go that far.
They were trying to force the Jews out of Germany. The problem was that many other countries did not want to take Jewish refugees. This is the middle of the Great Depression. Everybody has lots of their own poor people. They don't need penniless refugees from somewhere else. The Nazis wanted the Jews to go, but wouldn't allow them to take any property with them. So when they left Germany, if they decided to, they had to basically go totally impoverished unless they had family connections elsewhere.
There is a big emigration, a panic. People leave Germany in 1933.
Once they realized things could only get worse, they left. And of course the regime at that time wanted them to leave.
Almost 40,000 Jews left Germany between February and June 1933, most of them for neighboring European countries or for the United States.
Tens of thousands left Germany. Under the terms of the agreement between Germany and the Jewish Agency, 60,000 arrived in Israel.
An agreement was signed in 1933 by the German government, whose sole aim was to encourage and facilitate the emigration of German Jews to Palestine, if they accepted to abandon most of their goods and properties to the German state before they left.
The only ones to stay behind were those who still thought of Germany as their country and of themselves as Germans living in a civilized country that would never go too far.
Posing the question, why didn't they just leave, suggests that leaving was easy, and it was not easy. You had to leave your home, your community.
How can I support myself? What can I do in this other place? This is where I'm from. Why should I leave this country?
Many Jews were in professions that did not have easily transferable skills. They were intellectuals. Their professions depended on their command of the German language, lawyers, for instance.
How am I going to start all over again now that I'm 45, 50, 55, 60?
There's a wonderful line explains why German Jews didn't leave. The pessimist left, the optimist stayed. The pessimists, those who thought the situation was bad and was likely to get worse, they left. The optimists who felt the situation was bad, but I know Germany, this is my home, this is my land, this is my country, I know the people, I know the culture, I know Goethe and Schiller, Bach and Beethoven, these people could not do these things. Hitler's going to be en passant, he's gonna disappear. They're the people who stayed.
They didn't know what was going to happen. Jewish history is filled with crises and with persecution, and the Jews always survived. They always waited it out, and the trouble passed.
Not even the Jews felt in 1933 that the whole country would end up in flames. And when it happened, they were still there.
How could you have expected people in 1933, 1934 to have any idea what was going to happen?
They knew it was bad, they knew it was horrible, but they still wanted to believe. People want to believe and hope.
Sie vergewaltigten auch die deutsche Kultur, zersetzten die Literatur, nisteten sich im Theaterwesen ein, verunstalteten die Wissenschaft an den Hochschulen, verunglimpften die deutsche Kunst, machten sich die deutsche Presse hörig, zerstörten das deutsche Rechtsleben und vernichteten unsere Ehrauffassung, vergifteten den Geist der deutschen Wirtschaft, schufen das Glücksrittertum in der Industrie, beuteten den Bauer und Arbeiter aus und würdigten den deutschen Handel herab.
Had already 2 years of relentless Nazi propaganda, and the notion that the Jews are a different group, they don't belong in Germany, was now becoming much more firmly established. And the notion, therefore, that they needed to be, that it was quite right to exclude them from all these areas of society was growing.
Wir haben ein deutsches Theater, einen deutschen Film, eine deutsche Presse, ein deutsches Schrifttum, eine deutsche bildende Kunst, deutschen Rundfunk. Der früher oft gegen uns vorgebrachte Einwand, es gäbe keine Möglichkeit, die Juden aus dem Kunst- und Kulturleben zu beseitigen, weil deren zu viele seien und wir die leeren Plätze nicht neu besetzen könnten, ist glänzend widerlegt worden.
Increasing violence and systematic violence against Jews as Jews across the country really only begins in the summer of 1935.
Vor den Nürnberger Gesetzen
Nazis had brutally attacked Jews publicly and openly mocked mixed couples in the name of what was called Rassenschand, the shame of our race.
Öffentlich vorgeführt und ähnliches mehr.
The Nazi obsession with the purity of a so-called Aryan race showed itself most clearly in their public denunciation and repression of sexual unions between German men and Jewish women, or German women with Jewish men. And in the whole, the German people had no problem accepting this segregation.
There was some reaction abroad, in England and the United States, but there was no real protest. And there was none from the non-Jewish population of Germany either.
As long as they didn't have to see what was happening outside of their own community, everything was all right.
Wo war das Minimum an Menschlichkeit?
Where did you draw the line for inhumanity? At what point do you have to say, no, that I cannot accept. Every fibre of my being is against it. It's against all the values we've stood for up till now. Humanity, justice and law.
Germans were getting more and more used to the persecution of the Jews. Nobody lifted a finger. And for the Germans, this, of course, was the time of the greatest dishonor.
There were many local actions where people were confronted with violence, and that happened on a more or less daily basis, that Jews would be thrown out of a swimming pool and so on. They'd be beaten up, some Jews would be beaten up on the street. But you see in 1935 already, in the long period of the wave of anti-Semitism in 1935 that ended up with the Nuremberg laws.
There were lawyers at the Ministry of Justice and the Ministry of the Interior in charge of drawing up the law and consulting expert committees on how to formulate it.
I tried to define what a Jew was and to exclude certain sections from the citizenship for Reich citizenship.
They consulted lawyers, doctors, legal experts, intellectuals in the field and university professors for help in drawing up the law. To decide who was really a Jew, they even consulted raciologists, experts in the science of race.
There is a whole structure, agencies, bureaucrats who are devoted to deciding who is a Jew,
who was a Jew from who was not a Jew, and had some other restrictions of marital relations or sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews.
They were solemnly proclaimed at the Nuremberg Party Congress of September 1935.
Zweite Gesetz ist der Versuch der gesetzlichen Regelung eines Problems, das im Falle des abermaligen Scheiterns dann durch Gesetz zur endgültigen Lösung der nationalsozialistischen Partei übertragen werden müsste. Hinter allen drei Gesetzen steht die Partei und mit ihr und hinter ihr die deutsche Nation. Reichsbürger ist nur der Staatsangehörige deutschen oder artverwandten Blutes, der durch sein Verhalten beweist, dass er gewillt und geeignet ist, in Treue dem deutschen Volk und Reich zu dienen. Eheschließungen zwischen Juden und Staatsangehörigen deutschen oder artverwandten Blutes sind verboten.
When they are suddenly told you are aliens, you are not Germans, and that many of them who had thought of themselves as deeply embedded in society find that friends desert them, employers fire them, places they used to go, they can't go. This is an extraordinarily traumatic experience, to suddenly be thrown out of your sense of identity. Their whole sense of identity, in a sense, is denied, and that they have to rethink who they are and redefine themselves.
The Jews were of different blood to the Aryans, and that meant they were second-class citizens.
No matter how well you spoke German or how well you were integrated into German culture or even how long you'd been living on German soil, you'd never be a German if you didn't have German blood.
That's really the heart of the Nuremberg laws, the theory of race, but in its most biological sense. In other words, the Jew and his blood are contaminating the Aryan race.
So there was no point changing your passport or changing your religion. You were going to be Jewish forever, and you'd represent defiled blood that would pollute the human race until the end of time.
Even if their parents had been converted to Christianity, because the aim of the Nazis was to eliminate Jewish blood, and consequently it depended on the blood of the grandparents, not even the blood or the religious identity of the parents.
Many of the memoirs and testimonies of survivors is just how shattering this experience is, to suddenly no longer be part of the community that you thought you were a member of.
After I had read the Nuremberg laws, I was no more Jewish than a half hour before. My features had not suddenly become more Semitic. That death threat that I now felt clearly for the first time already contained in it what we have come to call the methodical degradation of the Jews by the Nazis. From that moment on, being Jewish for me meant being condemned, a marked man.
For
the majority of the population, the Nuremberg laws offered a bit more order and an end to all the violence and abuse. And most people found that acceptable.
A part of the population was even relieved, even if they weren't actually anti-Jewish. The Nuremberg laws came on the heels of a period of violent confrontations in the streets.
In 1935, the figures for emigration declined. Jewish people feel safe in Germany. It may seem incredible. They even believed that the Nuremberg laws would be the end of the worst persecution.
And as time went on, anti-Jewish sentiment became more extreme. People appeared indifferent, but behind their indifference, they knew precisely what was happening to the Jews.
In 1936, Germans were crazy about a new game, Juden raus, Jews out, a game for the whole family, a bit like Monopoly, which was created the same year in the States. It was a board game that claimed to be for old and young alike. Its creator was an engineer from Dresden. The rules of Juden raus were simple. The wooden board represented the streets of a town bordered by all kinds of Jewish shops, Cohen's, Goldman's, etc. The player threw the dice and landed on a space with the aim of going into the shop, taking its owner prisoner, and then choosing whether to send him to one of the camps or letting him go to Palestine. Get rid of 6 Jews and you're the winner, explained the instruction leaflet. The winner was the one who deported the most Jews.
Many Jews thought, well, it is horrible to be second class, to be the victim of discrimination, but the Jewish community was able to raise enough money to help the Jews who were made unemployed or who were suffering from the discrimination. German Jewry did not feel so threatened in 1936 that they felt they should all emigrate. It was possible to live, and to live quite well. During the era of the Olympic Games, you could go to Kurfürstendamm in Berlin, you could go to a restaurant, you could drink coffee, you could read Jüdische Rundschau, the Jewish paper, and no one would attack you. No one would molest you.
All the German Jews who came here to Israel in the 30s were on their balconies overlooking the sea, wishing they could go back to Europe, to Berlin, even if they had to swim.
And so there was a small trickle of Jews coming back. As soon as the Nazis realized that, they then banned any re-entry. So that this came to an end very quickly. But it was a misperception that the worst was over, that things in Germany had stabilized.
Optimism was deeply and profoundly dangerous. If you thought the situation would pass, you were wrong. And it only got worse.
The unlimited ambition of Heinrich Himmler propelled him in a meteoric rise from being a humble brown shirt to 10 years later inhabiting the highest echelons of power. Through his complete loyalty to Hitler, whom he first encountered in 1926, he became head of the SS. He would become the chief architect of what he would call a chapter of glory in our history, the annihilation of the Jewish people.
Himmler has become chief of German police. He is Reichsführer SS and chief of German police as of 1936. So all police are under him, and he sets out very concertedly to Nazify and to militarize the regular police.
The German police, gradually taken over by the SS, had become just another tool of ideology. Himmler was now the Nazi regime's most powerful man, both chief of the German police and head of the SS.
In the party, he'd always seemed like just a minor bureaucrat with no real status. His was a slow and difficult career.
The SS had really, up till then, been Hitler's personal bodyguards.
When Himmler took the helm, it had around 280 men. He very quickly turned it into a large paramilitary force. And that's how he laid the foundations of his future career. The organization grew very rapidly under his leadership.
Himmler built his power base within the regime step by step. He transformed the SS into an elite unit. His model was the knightly orders of the Middle Ages. The ideological basis was loyalty to Hitler and to the race. For recruits to the SS, he imposed racial testing. In order to join, you had to prove pure German origins right back to 1750.
That was an example of Himmler's very particular style that he developed to control the SS. He came up with special rites, special ceremonies. He controlled their choice of wives. They had to put in a special request to marry, and he'd often let it be known that they hadn't made the right choice.
The SS was a sort of militant Nazi organization, dressed up in ceremonies and codes, who considered themselves part of an elite, as first among equals.
They had to be over 5'7" tall, be German in appearance with blonde hair and blue eyes, and have been in the Hitler Youth. They had to provide their parents' political dossier and their brothers and sisters, and a report on their heredity and their family tree going back 2 centuries. Of the 2-year training, they spent the first 6 months in the German army, the Wehrmacht. Out of 100 recruits, only 10 would be kept on and would swear the SS oath.
Bei Gott, ich schwöre bei Gott, diesen heiligen Eid, dass ich dem Führer des Deutschen Reiches und Volkes, Adolf Hitler,
The SS uniform was designed by Hugo Boss. The contrast between the idea or the ideal and their physical appearance was now erased. A whole generation of young graduates, mostly lawyers, but also many historians, philosophers and linguists, joined the security services of the SS, which was founded by Reinhard Heinrich.
He was a young and very sensitive, artistic man. Played the violin, he was very musical. His father ran a music conservatoire. He was not the kind of speech-making, fist-thumping anti-Semite like Joseph Goebbels. He was rational, scientific, thoughtful. He didn't have any problem with the Jew as an individual. He had a problem with the Jew as the enemy of the Volk, of the Third Reich, as the enemy of the Aryans.
Heinrich was in his way an excellent organizer. He followed Himmler's wishes, and Himmler knew that he could count on him.
Heinrich and the SD become the think tank, the powerhouse of Judenpolitik, Jewish policy or anti-Jewish policy in the Third Reich.
Usually they had studied law at the university. Very often they had PhDs or doctorate degrees.
These were some of the most dangerous Nazi ideologues because they believed themselves to have a modern vision of what Germany and its people should be.
So in the head office of the SS, you have an extraordinary cadre of men who are highly educated, very gifted, intellectual, many of them cultured, but they also have an ethos which commands them to be tough, decisive, strong, to be merciless.
This was the top brass of the terror machine, of the forces of repression.
Some of the German opposition would rather die than fall into their hands, so you can imagine the extent of the sheer brutality they exercised.
It was a moral void that many intellectuals found attractive because it offered them a framework that was free of traditional notions of morality.
Himmler and Heydrich were responsible for the entire SS apparatus. They played a crucial role, and Himmler, as Reichskommissar, was there to firmly establish the German race.
The main source of pollution was the Jews. A whole new race had to be created. Lebensborn meant taking women of pure Aryan extraction and coupling them with hand-picked men from the SS to create a new Aryan super-race. Himmler played a central role in this, and through it all, his right-hand man was Heinrich. And when dealing with the Jews, Heinrich's right hand was Eichmann.
And that is the beginning of Eichmann's career in Jewish affairs. He learns about the Jews, about Jewish history. He observes the activities of the Jews in Germany and reports back to the SD. This is how Eichmann becomes an expert on the Jews, an expert on Zionism, but also an expert on emigration, because the policy of the Sicherheitsdienst was to encourage and later to force Jews to emigrate. Eichmann is, in the end, the SD's expert on emigration.
He knew everything about Jewish society and its leaders. Adolf Eichmann's speciality was spying on what Jews were thinking. How did they see the situation? What were they up to?
Had a file basically on all the Jews. And so they would keep the records on who the Jews were, where they lived, what they did, and so on and so forth. I read something like 1,100 files. I spent about 5 years doing that. So.
On the 12th of March 1938, Adolf Hitler's armies invaded Austria without encountering the least opposition. The country was annexed and became a province of the Third Reich. As an Austrian, Hitler's return to his native land was greeted with wild enthusiasm by the crowds. The reunification of Germany and Austria was forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles. The Western democracies, though, showed no reaction at all.
Eichmann goes down to Vienna with the intention of encouraging, forcing Jewish emigration. And in 24 hours, he has a plan. It's a brilliant plan. It's cruel. It's harsh.
Eichmann proves himself to be extraordinarily efficient. He's the one that sets up the method of accelerated emigration, coerced emigration of the Jews, so that Jews are leaving Austria in a much faster rate under Eichmann's management than they were leaving from the Third Reich.
They would sign over to the SS all of their assets, their property, their money. They would leave the building with nothing, but they would have a visa to leave Austria, a passport to get into another country. And because of this system, Eichmann was able to help force 50,000 Jews to emigrate from Austria to the Nazi leadership in Berlin. This was almost like a miracle.
So they call them the person responsible for Jewish affairs. Usually the Sachbearbeiter für Judenangelegenheiten is what the official German word is, the official person dealing with Jewish affairs.
The regime that is established in Vienna sets up a mechanism to strip the Jews of their resources, their property, their assets, their money, everything. When Goering hears about this systematic despoliation, stripping the Jews of Vienna of all of their wealth, he thinks, why not do this in Germany? If we can do it in Austria, we can do it in Germany. And Goering and others see the Jews as a source of money. This is the beginning of the policy of Aryanization. From the middle of 1938, it is all taken by the state, and very often it is taken in a violent way.
It all started in April 1938 and escalated right up until May, with terrible scenes in the streets.
All the Jewish refugees, nobody wanted them. But Roosevelt wanted to be seen to be doing something.
He was sympathetic to Jews who were being persecuted, but he was reluctant to engage in a big fight with his own State Department or the labor unions about immigrants coming into the United States. There were already immigration restrictions, and so he didn't do much.
They just couldn't change all the United States immigration laws.
Maybe we can persuade other countries as well to take in more refugees from Central Europe. And so there was a call for an international conference, and this was the conference held at Evian.
What finally led to the trap closing on the Jews was the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, the timid politics of the Western powers, and the closing of their borders.
They held a special conference on aiding the refugees. They didn't call them Jews. Jews weren't refugees. These were Germans living under the German regime.
We never spoke of a Jewish problem, we spoke of a refugee problem. Even though everybody understood the refugees were what? Were Jewish.
The Jews? They were nothing. Everywhere they were just a tiny minority.
It's not enough to ask why they didn't leave. Rather, why did nobody want to take them in?
They had nowhere to go. Nobody wanted them. Nobody wanted the Jews. Canada, for example, said, "One is too many." Switzerland said, "None is too many." In Australia, they said, "We despise anti-Semitism. We're against it. That's why we won't take any Jews. We don't want any anti-Semitism here in Australia."
Wasn't there enough room in Canada, in Brazil, Argentina, Australia? They're huge countries.
Too many countries said, we're not really countries of immigration, and we particularly don't want, some of them said it bluntly, Jews.
And at that conference, which was closed to the public, both England and America decided to do nothing.
The Swiss found it comforting to say, you see, we're just like everyone else, no different. It's an international problem. It's not up to us to resolve it. Anyway, look at all the others. They don't want the Jews either. So the whole conference was pretty shameful, not just the attitude of the Swiss.
And this is exactly the time when the outside world is beginning to seriously close borders to immigration. As the number of Jews trying to get out quickly increases, the number of places for them to go dramatically contracts.
Suddenly, there were lots of Austrian Jews with passports coming to Switzerland. They all had to be screened. So it was the Swiss who asked the Germans to come up with a solution.
Switzerland, neutral Switzerland, insisted that Jewish identity cards, German Jewish identity cards, be marked with the letter J.
It was the Swiss who insisted the German Jewish passports be marked.
Because they wanted to accept all Germans to come into Switzerland, except the Jews whom they were afraid would stay.
Sie haben doch kein Visum. Ja, ich bin ohne Visum gekommen, weil ich musste Wien innerhalb 48 Stunden verlassen und in dieser Zeit hätte ich mir das Visum nicht mehr beschaffen können. Also musste ich über Vorarlberg, durch Wald und Berge mit meiner Frau flüchten.
Hitler was convinced that neither Europe nor the United States would intervene to save the Jews. A few days after the Evian conference, he declared, "It is shameful how the democracies dribble with pity for the poor Jewish people, and yet remain stonily indifferent when it comes to actually helping them."